A small African moment flipped global expectations in under 1 hour, without tanks moving or speeches being delivered. What looked like a bold declaration of sovereignty suddenly collapsed into deletion and apology, exposing how fast authority dissolves when real pressure arrives quietly. Why should this matter to you now? And why does Ibrahim Traoré suddenly appear in discussions far beyond Burkina Faso's borders? Because what followed did not stay symbolic, and it revealed how power, fear, and leverage still decide outcomes long after the slogans fade. You are about to hear an explanation that most summaries avoid, not because it is hidden, but because it is uncomfortable for many actors involved. You will gain a clearer understanding of how authority actually operates when pressure is applied quickly and without spectacle. This is not material designed for casual listening. If you stop here, it becomes easy to misread what happened as a brief social media incident or a personal miscalculation that corrected itself. That shortcut feels reassuring, but it strips away the mechanics that quietly shape outcomes across governments, militaries, and alliances. Without those mechanics, it is easier to accept simplified narratives, recycled commentary, or emotional reactions that explain little and predict nothing. You would miss why responses converged so fast, why silence mattered more than statements, and why reversals can carry more signal than defiance. You would also miss how these moments teach leaders, institutions, and observers what consequences are real and which are performative. Staying with this analysis means understanding what incentives were triggered, which risks were weighed, and why certain lines were never crossed. It means seeing the difference between public posture and private calculation, and recognizing how quickly credibility can be gained or lost when the stakes become tangible. The first thing to understand is that this episode was never really about a tweet, an apology, or even a single individual acting impulsively. It was about how quickly informal signals can trigger formal consequences when power relationships are already well defined. One number captures this shift with uncomfortable clarity: roughly 60 minutes passed between a public show of defiance and a complete reversal, including deleted statements and restored cooperation. That compressed timeline matters. In most diplomatic crises, escalation and de-escalation unfold over days or weeks, with space for back-channel messaging and public narrative control. Here, the window was so short that it exposed the underlying hierarchy almost in real time. The faster the reversal, the clearer it becomes which constraints are non-negotiable and which postures are mostly theatrical. The background to this moment stretches far beyond you and a single confrontation. For decades, many African governments have relied on external military assistance, training programs, intelligence sharing, and financial support to maintain internal stability and regional standing. Those arrangements come with implicit expectations, even when they are not written into treaties or announced at press conferences. When those expectations are challenged, the response is often swift and decisive, not through public threats but through private reminders of dependency. What made this case resonate across the continent was how visible the mechanism became. Younger audiences, already skeptical of long-standing leadership structures, watched a claim of sovereignty collide with material reality. Older institutions recognized something else: a familiar pattern repeating itself with modern tools and shorter cycles. Social media did not change the power dynamic, it merely sped up its exposure. This is where Ibrahim Traoré enters broader conversations, even without being directly involved in the incident. His name is increasingly used as a reference point because he represents a contrasting posture, one that tests how far autonomy can be asserted before similar pressures appear. Whether that contrast is sustainable or symbolic remains an open question, but the comparison itself shows how attentively these moments are being studied. Seen this way, the incident becomes less about embarrassment and more about instruction. It teaches observers how leverage is applied, how quickly lines are enforced, and how narratives adjust after decisions already made. That lesson is what continues to echo long after the original posts disappeared. At this stage, the story needs a guide, someone who helps interpret what is happening without turning it into slogans. In this case, that role is played less by a single individual and more by a recurring pattern that seasoned observers immediately recognize. Analysts who follow African civil-military relations did not focus on the apology itself, but on how effortlessly the system corrected the deviation. One early impact was visible inside institutions rather than on the streets. Officials and officers understood the signal boundaries had been tested and instantly reinforced. That clarity travels fast within power structures. It shapes future decisions long before they are announced, encouraging caution, self-censorship, and alignment with what is already known to be acceptable. No directive was needed, the example was enough. A second, parallel impact appeared among younger political audiences. Many had initially seen the defiant statements as a rare break from established behavior. The speed of the reversal turned that hope into something called a confirmation that public rhetoric oft unmasks private limits. This was not an isolated reaction. Similar disappointments have accumulated across different countries, feeding a broader sense of distrust toward performative leadership. Here, comparisons started to form. Ibrahim Traoré was invoked in conversations precisely because he symbolizes an attempt to operate outside that familiar script. Supporters point to his choices as evidence that alternatives exist, while critics argue that such postures invite consequences that have not yet fully materialized. Either way, the contrast sharp and awareness of how constrained most leaders actually are. The key realization is simple but unsettling. Authority is not only about who speaks, but about who can afford not to retreat. When an early test ends this quickly, it stops being a local episode and becomes a reference point for everyone watching closely. From that moment on, the situation was no longer small, and it was no longer ignorable. It began abruptly, without warning signs or gradual build-up. A public statement appeared, sharpened, confrontational, accusing foreign actors of interference and announcing an immediate suspension of cooperation. Within minutes, the message spread, screens lit up, and the tone shifted from routine politics to open challenge. For a brief moment, it looked like a line had been crossed. Then, the pressure arrived. Not as a press release, not as a public threat, but as private communication moving faster than the headlines. Messages were deleted. Language softened. Certainty evaporated. What had been framed as a decisive stand turned into an explanation about misinformation, followed by an apology that restored everything to its previous state. The entire arc, from ignition to retreat, fit inside roughly 1 hour, compressing what normally unfolds over weeks into a single cycle. The escalation did not stop there, even as the surface calmed. Reactions multiplied across institutions and borders. Diplomats recalibrated their talking points. Military planners quietly noted the limits that had just been enforced. Political actors elsewhere absorbed the signal without needing it spelled out. The lesson was not in what was said publicly, but in how quickly the situation corrected itself once consequences became tangible. As the aftershock spread, the narrative deepened. Commentators stopped asking whether the initial move was sincere and started asking why it collapsed so cleanly. Attention shifted to dependency, leverage, and the invisible architecture that governs cooperation. The incident became a case study, cited in private briefings and analytical circles, as an example of how modern power operates when tested unexpectedly. In these discussions, Ibrahim Traoré surfaced again, not as a participant, but as a contrast. His posture, oft unframed as resistant to external pressure, was measured against this rapid reversal. Supporters argued that different choices produce different outcomes. Skeptics countered that timelines matter and that consequences sometimes lag behind defiance. Either way, the comparison added weight to the episode, turning it into more than a huge and on affair. What lingered after the dust settled was not outrage but recalculation. Actors adjusted expectations. Boundaries felt firmer. The system had demonstrated its reflexes, showing how quickly deviation is corrected when incentives and dependencies are aligned. The timeline closed where it began, with cooperation intact and statements erased. But the memory of the sequence remained. Once events can unfold this fast, they no longer fade quietly. They become reference points, shaping future behavior long after the immediate drama has passed. That is why this sequence still matters, and why it continues to be replayed in conversations about power, autonomy, and the real cost of testing the limits. Before numbers appear, it is important to reset how they are read. These figures are not presented to impress or overwhelm, but to anchor the discussion in measurable constraints. They show scale, speed, and human exposure in ways that rhetoric cannot. This is the point where the story stops being interpretive and starts becoming structural. The first number defines scale. Uganda's security and military cooperation with the United States accounts for a substantial share of its external defense support, including training, intelligence coordination, and logistical assistance. In practical terms, this cooperation represents years of institutional dependence built into planning cycles and operational readiness. Losing even a portion of that support would not be symbolic, it would immediately strain capacity and credibility. The second number captures speed. The reversal happened in roughly 60 minutes, a time frame that is exceptionally short by diplomatic standards. That delta matters because it signals precising thresholds. When a response arrives this fast, it suggests that escalation scenarios were already mapped and that corrective action was triggered the moment a boundary was crossed. Speed. Here is evidence of clarity, not confusion. The third number brings the impact closer to people. Uganda has one of the youngest populations in the region, with a majority under 30 years old, many of whom already face high unemployment and political exclusion. When military and political tensions spike, even briefly, the risks are not abstract. They translate into heightened security measures, fear of repression, and disrupted economic activity, all of which fall disproportionately on younger and more vulnerable groups. Taken together, these figures change the weight of the episode. Scale shows how much was at stake. Speed shows how little tolerance existed for deviation. Human exposure shows who ultimately absorbs the consequences. None of this requires speculation about intentions or private conversations. The numbers alone outline the boundaries within which decisions were made. This quantitative framing also explains why comparisons to Ibrahim Traoré keep resurfacing. Observers are not only comparing personalities or rhetoric, but different numerical realities. Different dependency ratios, different timelines, different risk distributions. Whether those differences will hold under similar pressure remains unknown. But the contrast sharpens awareness of what the numbers allow and what they forbid. Once the data is laid out, the episode looks less like a personal embarrassment and more like a predictable outcome. Systems behave consistently when incentives are aligned and costs are clear. In this case, the measurements show that the cost of sustained defiance was far higher than the cost of immediate retreat, and the choice followed accordingly. Numbers do not tell the whole story, but they narrow the range of plausible explanations. Here, they point in one direction: power was not negotiated in public. It was enforced through well-understood constraints that left very little room to maneuver. It would be too simple to stop here and declare the less unsettled, because there are serious countergameston that deserve to be taken at their strongest. One common view holds that the reversal was not weakness, but prudence. From this perspective, leaders have a responsibility to de-escalate when information is uncertain, especially when military cooperation and regional stability are involved. A rapid apology can be framed as damage control, not surrender, a way to prevent a spiral that would hurt civilians more than elites. That argument has weight. In fragile political environments, restraint can save lives. Public accusations made on incomplete intelligence can trigger sanctions, funding freezes, or security shocks that ripple far beyond the original dispute. Seen this way, stepping back quickly is not betrayal of sovereignty, but recognition that leadership includes knowing when to pull back before costs become irreversible. A second counter-argument focuses on symbolism versus substance. Critics of the critical reading argue that social media statements are not policy, and deleting them should not be over-interpreted. Real power, they say, lies in long-term agreements, budgets, and deployments, not in online theatrics. According to this view, treating a tweet and its deletion as a decisive geopolitical moment risks inflating noise into narrative and ignoring the deeper continuity of state behavior. This perspective also deserves consideration. Many governments compartmentalize messaging and action. Officials post impulsively, institutions quietly correct, and the machinery of cooperation continues unchanged. From that angle, the episode could be seen as proof that institutions still function, capable of absorbing shocks without derailing strategic relationships. Yet when these arguments are placed next to the observable facts, their limits become clear. Prudence explains de-escalation, but not the extreme speed of reversal. Institutional correction explains continuity, but not why the boundary was enforced so visibly. If the statements were truly inconsequential, there would have been little urgency to erase them within an hour. This is where the balance shifts. The episode was not important because a mistake was corrected, but because the correction revealed where non-negotiable lines sit. That is why comparisons to Ibrahim Traoré persist. They are less about praise or condemnation, and more about asking whether different postures face the same invisible ceilings or whether some actors are operating under genuinely different constraints. When both sides of the argument are weighed carefully, a clearer picture emerges. The reversal can be rational and still revealing. It can be prudent and still instructive. Understanding that duality is what allows observers to move beyond slogans and see how power actually behaves when tested. Everything changed at that moment. The turning point was not the apology itself, but the realization of what the apology signaled to everyone watching closely. Once the reversal became public, the incident stopped being a Hugh and on episode and started functioning as a reference test. It showed how quickly informal defiance meets formal limits, and how those limits are enforced without spectacle. From that instant, the story gained a second layer, one that had less to do with personalities and more to do with architecture. This is the midpoint where interpretations split. Some observers focused on embarrassment and optics. Others, more quietly, focused on calibration. They asked what had just been measured and how those measurements would be used next time. Power, in this reading, was not exercised through punishment but through demonstration. The system showed that it did not need escalation to correct behavior. Speed alone was enough. That realization reframed parallel cases. When Ibrahim Traoré is discussed in the same breath, it is no longer about rhetoric or symbolism. It becomes about timing, buffers, and tolerance thresholds. The question shifts from who speaks boldly to who can absorb delay, friction, and cost without immediate reversal. That is a deeper and more uncomfortable comparison. From here on, the earlier facts still matter, but they are no longer sufficient. The focus moves away from what was said and toward what was learned. Actors adjust not because they were told to, but because the demonstration was clear. Once that lesson lands, the story does not reset to zero. It moves forward into consequences that unfold more slowly, but reach much further. The consequences did not stake and fine to analysis rooms or online debates. Once the midpoint passed, the effects began to show up in places where decisions meet daily reality. What had looked like a brief incident started to leave marks across institutions, markets, communities, and regional calculations. At the level of the state, the first consequence was internal discipline. Decision-makers became more cautious, not because of public criticism, but because the boundaries had just been demonstrated. Ministries, security agencies, and diplomatic offices adjusted their behavior quietly. Statements were vetted more tightly. Risks were escalated upward faster. The cost of misalignment had been clarified, and that clarity reshaped how authority was exercised from the inside. For businesses and economic actors, the signal landed differently but just as firmly. Stability is not only about laws on paper, it is about predictability. When reversals happen this quickly, investors and partners read it as proof that external relationships outweigh internal signaling. That reduces uncertainty in one sense, but it also narrows the range of acceptable policy moves. Companies recalibrate expectations, delay commitments, and price political dependence into their decisions. The most tangible impact appears among ordinary people. Political tension, even brief, translates into heightened security presence, disrupted routines, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. Young people, already navigating limited economic opportunities and political voice, absorb these shocks first. Each episode reinforces the perception that real decisions happen elsewhere, and that public gestures rarely change lived outcomes. Over time, the gap feeds apathy or resentment, both of which carry long-term social costs. Beyond national borders, the regional effect is subtle but significant. Neighboring governments and regional organizations take note of how quickly correction occurs. It becomes part of the shared understanding that shapes coordination in security, diplomacy, and crisis response. No meeting needs to reference the episode explicitly. Its lesson is already integrated into assumptions about what is possible and what is not. This is why the comparison to Ibrahim Traoré keeps returning at this stage. The contrast is no longer about ideology or tone, but about consequences. Observers ask whether different trajectories produce different pressures, or whether similar limits will assert themselves over longer timelines. The answer remains open, but the question itself reflects how far the discussion has moved beyond the original event. Taken together, these layers show that the impact was not dramatic, but pervasive. No single group escaped it, and no reaction cancelled it out. The state adjusted. Businesses recalculated, people internalized the message, and the region updated its expectations. Once consequences spread this widely, the episode stops being temporary. That is the quiet weight of what happened. Not a collapse, not a crisis, but a redistribution of certainty about where power resides and how it is enforced. When that certainty settles in, it shapes choices long after the headlines fade. Looking ahead, the most likely path is not dramatic rupture, but managed continuity under tighter discipline. Cooperation continues, statements become more cautious, and informal challenges are avoided before they reach the public stage. The system absorbs the shock and moves forward, slightly more rigid than before, with fewer experiments at the margins. Stability holds. But it is a stability shaped by restraint rather than confidence. Over time, this produces predictability, yet it also reinforces the sense that meaningful deviation carries immediate cost. A more optimistic scenario depends on deliberate recalibration rather than confrontation. Leaders learn from the episode without internalizing fear, separating symbolic expression from strategic action more carefully. Channels for negotiation are strengthened, expectations clarified, and moments of friction handled earlier and more quietly. In this version, credibility is rebuilt not through defiance, but through consistency and competence. The result is not full autonomy, but a wider operational space where missteps do not instantly trigger correction. The worst-case scenario unfolds if the lesson is misunderstood. Instead of caution, act as internalized paralysis, avoiding necessary decisions out of fear of invisible thresholds. Public trust erodes further as citizens perceive leaders as constrained and reactive. In parallel, external partners become less tolerant of ambiguity, enforcing limits more often and more bluntly. Under these conditions, frustration accumulates until it breaks out in less controllable ways, shifting pressure from institutions to the streets. Across all three scenarios, the underlying variable is not ideology but judgment. The episode demonstrated that choices are made within narrow bands of tolerance, and that timing matters as much as intent. Observers draw comparisons to figures like Ibrahim Traoré, not to predict outcomes, but to test assumptions about how different strategies interact with those bands over time. Whether alternative postures expand or simply delay constraint remains uncertain. The most useful takeaway is not to guess which scenario will prevail, but to recognize that each is shaped by decisions already in motion. Awareness, preparation, and disciplined thinking reduce the risk of being trapped by surprise. The future will not hinge on one statement or one apology, but on how well actors understand the system they are operating within, and how carefully they choose when to test it. After following the arc of events and the scenarios ahead, the question naturally turns inward. What does this actually mean for the person listening, watching, and trying to make sense of it all? The significance changes depending on where one stands, but no one is completely outside its reach. For those who actively follow political and geopolitical shifts, this episode offers an advantage that is easy to miss. Understanding how quickly boundaries are enforced sharpens judgment. It helps separate rhetoric from capacity and alerts attentive observers to early signals before they become obvious. That awareness does not guarantee influence, but it reduces surprise. It allows people in this group to read statements with more discipline, track dependencies more carefully, and avoid mistaking volume for leverage. A second group feels the impact indirectly. These are people whose work, income, or sense of stability is shaped by broader political conditions even if they are not engaged in politics themselves. For them, moments like this translate into uncertainty rather than ideology. Investment pauses, hiring slows, prices fluctuate, and anxiety creeps in quietly. The most useful response here is not alarm, but adjustment, recalibrative expectations, building small buffers, and recognizing that external shocks often arrive faster than explanations. Then there are those who assume the story has little to do with them. Distance can feel protective, yet indifference carries its own risk. When power dynamics shift and corrections happen silently, those who are least informed are often the last to adapt. By the time consequences become personal, options have already narrowed. This is why names like Ibrahim Traoré surface even among people far from Burkina Faso. They function as signals in a larger conversation about limits, timing, and choice. Paying attention does not require taking sides. It requires staying aware enough not to be caught off guard. No matter which group someone belongs to, understanding this pattern offers something simple but valuable: the ability to anticipate rather than react. That alone can make the difference between feeling powerless and remaining prepared. Solutions cannot remain at the level of slogans or moral positioning, because the episode itself showed how quickly vague commitments collapse under pressure. What matters is execution, and execution only works when responsibility, timing, and measurement are clear. The path forward therefore has to be practical, not rhetorical. At the leadership and state level, the first step is internal discipline. Decision-making chains need clearer thresholds for public communication, especially on security and foreign relations. Statements should be stress-tested before release, not corrected afterward. Progress here is measurable through fewer rapid reversals, tighter message coherence, and reduced need for emergency damage control within short time windows. The second step belongs to institutions and partner organizations. Military, diplomatic, and economic actors must map their dependencies honestly and plan around them, rather than pretending they do not exist. That means diversifying cooperation where possible, clarifying red lines privately, and building buffers that slow fast reactions. Success is visible when negotiations absorb friction quietly instead of exporting it into public crises. The third step involves citizens and civil society. While individuals cannot shift geopolitical constraints alone, they can reduce vulnerability by demanding consistency rather than spectacle. This shows up in media literacy, pressure for accountability over theatrics, and support for leaders who explain limits instead of denying them. Change here is measured less by protests and more by shifts in expectations and civic conversation. In some contexts, a fourth layer becomes necessary: regional coordination. Shared standards and mutual support can widen room for maneuver, though they require patience and trust. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré are often invoked at this stage as symbols of alternative approaches. But the real test is not symbolism. It is whether institutions can sustain autonomy without triggering immediate correction. Ultimately, the solution is not about dramatic resistance or quiet submission. It is about aligning ambition with capacity and timing action so that pressure does not dictate outcomes. When execution improves, credibility follows. And with credibility comes a little more space to choose. Earlier, the story introduced a recurring image of correction happening faster than expectation, a moment when posture met structure and structure won. Returning to that image now feels different because the path taken since then has filled it with weight. What first looked like a brief adjustment has unfolded into a long lesson about limits and consequence. From the opening tension to the quiet recalibration that followed, the journey traced how authority is tested, revealed, and then absorbed back into routine. Along the way, comparisons emerged not as slogans but as signals. Ibrahim Traoré appeared in these reflections not as a hero or a warning, but as a reference point that sharpened contrast and forced deeper questions about what autonomy really costs. The emotional residue of this story does not come from outrage or triumph. It comes from recognition. Recognition that power often speaks softly, that decisions are shaped before they are announced, and that reversals can carry more meaning than declarations. For many listeners, that realization lingers longer than any single fact. At its core, this was never just about one incident. It was about choice under pressure, and about how systems respond when those choices test their boundaries. Once that understanding settles in, the story stops feeling distant. From here, the weight shifts. What matters is not who spoke the loudest, but who understood the moment well enough to act without illusion. That understanding is what remains. As this story comes to a close, it is worth pausing on the fact that no single interpretation will feel complete for everyone. Each listener brings a different background, a different threshold for risk, and a different sense of what responsibility looks like in moments like this. That diversity of perspective is not a weakness. It is exactly what keeps these conversations alive. If this analysis felt worth your time, it is likely because it moved beyond headlines and into mechanisms that usually remain implicit. Stories like this gain value when they circulate among people who are willing to think slowly, question assumptions, and resist easy conclusions. Sharing that kind of perspective helps others see patterns they might otherwise miss. This is also an invitation, not a directive. An invitation to reflect on how power operates, how limits are enforced, and how figures such as Ibrahim Traoré become symbols in much larger debates about autonomy and constraint. Whether you agree with the framing or not, engaging with it critically is part of staying informed rather than reactive. So consider this an open conversation rather than a closing statement. What stood out to you most in this sequence of events? And what do you think matters more going forward? Bold posture, careful timing, or something else entirely?